On August 15th, 1947, India gained independence from Britain after more than 300 years of colonial rule, first under the East India Company and then under the British Raj. The results of freedom included an arbitrary line by which Britain created two new nation states, India and Pakistan. The result was the displacement of millions of people and the division of many communities. One of the regions most deeply affected by what has now been called partition was colonial Punjab. Despite the numerous individuals, organizations, and events that led to India's freedom, India's independence has most often been associated with one historical figure, Mohandas K. Gandhi, pictured here as a young lawyer. But even Gandhi would agree that independence was about much more than him. It was often about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Today, I'd like to talk to you about one of these ordinary people, a man that I've been researching for the last 7 years. His name is Baba Gurdit Singh. Gurdit Singh poses a dramatic contrast to Gandhi. If Gandhi fought the British from South Africa and from India, marching to the shores and looking out at the sea during the Great Salt March, for example, Gurdit Singh fought the British from the sea. In 1914, in an unprecedented maritime voyage, he chartered the SS Komagata-Maru, a British-built and Japanese-owned steamship, and transported 376 passengers from Hong Kong to Vancouver Harbour. Gurdit Singh demanded that Indians have the same rights to mobility as their British counterparts. Gurdit Singh poses quite a contrast to Gandhi. Unlike Gandhi, he was not a lawyer, he wasn't educated in London. He was a self-made man, an entrepreneur. If Gandhi rejected commerce as a form of colonialism, Gurdit Singh embraced it. He believed that commerce was one vehicle through which India could reach independence. At the age of 26, he followed his brother and his father, leaving his native village in Punjab, a landlocked and agrarian region which, as I said earlier, was most deeply affected by partition, and followed them first to Malaya and then to Singapore. He worked for a pork dealer and then a dairy farmer, eventually beginning a flourishing railway contracting business. Though he started in the railway contracting business, his real ambition was around shipping. The Komagata-Maru's voyage was intended to be a commercial venture. Gurdit Singh had planned to start the Guru Nanak Steamship Company, which would own 4 ships, including the Komagata-Maru. It would follow 2 routes from Bombay to Brazil and Calcutta to Canada, transporting Indians and commodities, including iron and ore, and placing India in the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean worlds. The ship's journey was intended to be a commercial venture. Gurdit Singh sold tickets to passengers. He carried coal aboard the ship, which he intended to sell once the ship arrived in Vancouver. What began as a commercial venture soon became a political event. In 1908, the Dominion of Canada passed the continuous journey provision. The provision required that all migrants make a direct journey from their country of birth or naturalization to Canada. When Gurdit Singh chartered the ship, the continuous journey provision had been struck down. But when the ship arrived in Vancouver Harbour, the law had been rewritten and reinstated. The lawyers for the Komagata-Maru's passengers argued that the passengers should be allowed to enter Canada freely as British subjects. They also argued that those aboard the ship did not draw a distinction between Hong Kong, Canada, and India. These were all part of the British Empire, and as British subjects, they had the right to travel freely. The case was first heard at the Immigration Board and then at the British Columbia Court of Appeal, and the 5 judges unanimously agreed that the passengers arriving on the Komagata-Maru contravened all 3 orders in council, including the continuous journey provision, and should be deported immediately. The Komagata-Maru's voyage had a dramatic effect on Canada's immigration laws. Indians were not allowed to enter Canada until 1947, when India gained independence from Britain. Perhaps what is less known is how the Komagata-Maru's journey also transformed India's security and border control practices. In September 1914, when the ship's arrival was anticipated by the Indian colonial government, Indian authorities hastily passed the Ingress into India Ordinance. The law gave authorities an unprecedented power to arrest, register, detain, and imprison anyone suspected of anti-British and anti-colonial activities while abroad. This included all of the passengers on the Komagata. Authorities argued that under the guidance of Gurdit Singh, these passengers were criminals and seditionists who would create an uprising against the British upon landing. When the Komagata left Vancouver Harbour, World War I commenced. The Great War gave Indian authorities additional legitimacy for this new repressive law. Although the law was supposed to be repealed 6 months after the end of the war, it remained in effect for 4 additional years. Its reach was extensive, its effects alarming. Between 1915 and 1916, and in Punjab alone, over 3,000 men were detained in their village under suspicions of seditious activities. When the Komagata arrived in Calcutta, the passengers were greeted by Bengali police and by Indian military officials. They were told that they would be forced to return to their villages in Punjab on a special train. When many refused to go, a violent conflict ensued. What came to be known as the Budge Budge Massacre resulted in the death of 40 people, including 19 passengers. Many more people were injured, and over 200 were imprisoned in the Alipore jail in Calcutta. Gurdit Singh narrowly escaped police. For 7 years, he became a fugitive. He traveled westward and northward through the subcontinent by train, by foot, and by bullock cart, hiding in fields, in jungles, and in forests in efforts to evade police. He stopped for several years in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, where he disguised himself as an herbalist, and then in Bombay, where he disguised himself as the manager and doctor of a shipbuilding factory. It was during his years as a fugitive that he met a number of nationalist leaders, including Gandhi. Gandhi was particularly impressed by what Gurdit Singh had accomplished. By transporting 376 migrants across the Pacific Ocean from Hong Kong to Vancouver, Gandhi argued that Gurdit Singh had shook the imperial government and awakened in sleeping India, and it was now time for him to turn himself in and to claim his spot as a national hero. Gurdit Singh did eventually turn himself in. His arrest became a major event that was reported in Indian newspapers as well as in other parts of the British Empire, including Canada, Singapore, and Malaysia. He was arrested first under the Ingress into India Ordinance, a law that he managed to evade for 7 years, and then under the Indian Penal Code for sedition. He served 5 years in the Mianwali jail, which is now in contemporary Pakistan. Despite his accomplishments, Gurdit Singh has received very little attention in Canada and even less in India. In 2014, to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the Komagata, Canada Post issued the special commemorative stamp showing Gurdit Singh at the helm of a ship. But Canadians still know little about what he accomplished, about how he managed to transport these passengers from Hong Kong to Vancouver with little experience as a mariner. Even less is known about him in India. To remember Gurdit Singh is to remember an anti-colonial hero, an ordinary man who did an extraordinary thing and inspired many people to seek freedom from British rule. But to remember Gurdit Singh is about much more than just anti-colonialism in India. Rather than turning inward and looking at the subcontinent, he looked outward to the sea, embracing it as a site of commercial, political, and legal struggle. Today, 90% of our goods continue to be moved by ships on the ocean. Today, we see migrants perishing in various places in the world on voyages and on ships that echo the Komagata. To remember Gurdit Singh, then, is not just to remember a national and anti-colonial hero, or to remember the rich legacies of Indian independence. To remember Gurdit Singh is to remember the sea, a place that we cannot afford to forget. Thank you.